So you shared some interesting data recently about shifts in travel patterns for Canadians, especially heading stateside.
Yeah, definitely some noticeable changes.
Okay, so for this deep dive, let's really get into that core question. What are the key trends, the main shifts we're seeing in Canadian travel to the U.S.?
And importantly, why? What's driving these changes?
Exactly. We've got the latest Statistics Canada numbers, plus some really good insights from people right there in the travel industry.
Yeah, travel agents, airline folks,
So the goal here, our mission, if you like, is to understand the factors at play.
and maybe get a sense of what this signals for future travel choices.
Perfect. It's a great snapshot. By looking at these sources together, we should be able to piece together a clearer picture.
Agreed. So where should we start? The numbers.
Yeah, let's jump right into the numbers. The thing that immediately jumped out at me was the really significant drop in Canadians coming back home by car from the U.S.
The border crossings, yeah.
This past April, we saw a 35.2% decrease compared to April last year. That's quite a drop.
It really is. And even more striking when you compare it to pre-pandemic.
Right. Compared to April 2019, it's down 45.1%, nearly half.
Wow, that's substantial.
And it's not just a one-month thing, is it?
No, that's the key point. This April was actually the fourth consecutive month we've seen that year-over-year decline for car returns.
4 months straight.
Yeah, so it really suggests we're looking at something more than just a bit of random fluctuation or seasonality. It points towards a pattern.
Okay, so road trips are down. What about flying?
Well, air travel for Canadians returning from the U.S. in April also saw a decrease.
How much?
It was down by almost 20%, 19.9% to be exact, compared to last year. So fewer flights back from the States as well.
Okay, fewer cars, fewer planes from the U.S., but here's where it gets interesting, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because while fewer Canadians were flying back from the States, the data shows a 9.9% increase in air travel returns from overseas destinations during that same period.
Ah, okay. So it really does seem like Canadians haven't just, stopped traveling altogether.
Not necessarily staying home, no.
Yeah.
It looks more like their destinations might be changing. They're choosing differently.
Right. Swapping one destination for another, perhaps. We also saw an overall dip in international arrivals into Canada in April.
That includes everyone, right? Canadians and
Yeah,
visitors.
both Canadians and non-residents coming by air and car. That was down about 15% from the year before.
Okay.
So with this clear pullback from the U.S., both land and air, the big question is why? Some people in the booking industry are talking about this elbows up attitude tied to trade tensions. What's the thinking there?
Well, the idea, based on some of the industry commentary we saw, is that the recent history of trade disputes
Right.
and maybe a feeling, rightly or wrongly, of a less welcoming stance from the U.S. might have influenced travel decisions for some Canadians.
The source specifically mentioned former President Trump's tariffs.
Yes, and some of the rhetoric around that time, the suggestion is that these factors might have sort of tarnished the image of U.S. travel for some Canadians, made it less appealing.
And we heard from Richard Vanderlub at tripcentral.ca. He seemed pretty convinced this trend
Away from the U.S. for leisure travel.
is likely to stick around, maybe even intensify.
Yeah, that was his prediction. He made a really interesting point, I thought,
Which was,
that you might not have seen tons of immediate cancellations, especially because people had non-refundable bookings, that sort of thing.
right, you're already committed.
Exactly. But the real impact, he thinks, will show up in future travel plans. Decisions being made now about next year's vacation, for example.
That makes sense. People might follow through on existing plans, but rethink the next one.
Right. And Vanderlove anticipates that things like, word of mouth, maybe social media discussions, even boycotts could play a bigger role in shaping where people decide to go next. It suggests a more conscious choice of destination, maybe tied to broader feelings or politics.
Definitely sounds like travelers making more deliberate choices, not just defaulting to the closest option.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. What are the travel agencies themselves seeing, like on the front lines?
Well, Flight Central reported a really eye-popping number.
Yeah.
A 53% drop in their bookings to the U.S. in April. 53%.
Wow, that's huge. Hard to ignore that.
It is a massive decrease. But interestingly, Amra Durakovic from Flight Central offered a slightly different perspective on it.
Oh, how so?
She suggested it might be less about a sort of permanent turn away from the U.S.
Okay.
and maybe more of a recalibration, as she put it. linked to general uncertainty that's hitting travel demand across the board.
So maybe not just about trade or politics, but a wider sense of caution, perhaps? Economic uncertainty, global events, that kind of thing?
That seemed to be part of her thinking, yeah, a broader recalibration.
But she also pointed out something that fits with the overseas travel numbers, didn't she?
She did. She noted they're seeing much more interest in other parts of the world.
Like where?
Places like Europe, Asia, South America were mentioned, specifically increased bookings to Japan, South Korea, Thailand, even Colombia.
Interesting. So it really does seem like if Canadians are pulling back from the U.S., they're actively looking elsewhere, east and further south.
That lines up perfectly with the StatCan data showing that rise in air travel from overseas, doesn't it?
It really does. It reinforces that idea. Canadians still want to travel. They've got the bug.
Yeah.
They're just maybe redirecting where they go.
Which naturally leads you to ask, well, how are the airlines responding to all this?
Good point.
Yeah.
Because they must be seeing these trends in their own booking data.
Presumably.
And we are seeing Canadian carriers adjusting things. Air Canada, for instance.
What do they do?
They cut flights to some big traditional U.S. sunspots. Florida, Vegas, Arizona by 10%. That was back in March.
Okay, a noticeable cut.
And it wasn't just them. WestJet, Flair, Air Transat. They all made similar reductions around that time.
So a pretty clear signal they were seeing lower demand on those U.S. routes.
Seems like it, but maybe even more telling is where they're adding flights.
Right, Air Canada's plan for Latin America.
Exactly. Boosting capacity into Latin America by 16% starting this October. 16%.
Wow, okay. That's a significant shift in focus, a strong bet on where they think future demand is heading.
It really looks that way, positioning themselves for where Canadians are looking to go.
And this ties back to what Emma Durkovich said, doesn't it? About intentional travel.
Yeah, her phrase was Canadians are traveling with more intention. Explain that a bit.
Well, the idea seems to be that people who have a specific reason or a strong desire to go to the U.S., they'll still go.
Sure, visiting family, a specific event.
Right. But maybe others who might have just defaulted to the U.S. before because it was easy or familiar are now actively thinking, where else could I go? And exploring alternatives that maybe appeal more for different reasons. Novelty, cost, maybe even values alignment.
That idea of intentional travel really resonates. It suggests more thoughtful decision-making process.
Yeah, choosing destinations more consciously, perhaps looking for new experiences or wanting to explore beyond the usual spots.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. We're definitely seeing this noticeable drop in Canadians traveling to the U.S.
Both by car, for those maybe shorter trips or cross-border shopping, and by air, for potentially longer stays or vacations.
And this shift seems to be driven by, well, a mix of things.
Yeah, partly those potential trade-related feelings, the elbows-up idea, but also maybe just a broader trend of Canadians wanting to explore more widely, check out other international destinations.
And we have those two angles on the why, don't we?
Right. One view points to a more deliberate pullback, maybe linked to politics or economics.
And the other
Suggests it's more of a general recalibration of travel, with people actively choosing new experiences elsewhere, like Asia or Latin America.
And maybe the truth involves a bit of both.
Quite possibly. These trends rarely have just one single cause, do they?
No, usually a combination of factors. So as you're listening to this, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Considering these shifts, these factors we've discussed, what could the long-term impact be, for travel patterns between Canada and the U.S.?
Will this trend continue? Will it reverse or stabilize somewhere new?
And beyond just the things we talked about today, trade, alternative destinations, what other maybe global events or bigger societal trends might shape these choices even more in the years ahead?
Yeah, things like currency fluctuations, climate concerns, other geopolitical shifts. Lots to consider.
Definitely something to keep in mind, perhaps, the next time you're mapping out your own travel plans.